Well, hello, Jonathan Rose. How are you?
Good, thank you, David. How are you?
I'm great. Looking forward to this conversation. Let me introduce you. You are an amazing person, and on Wikipedia, we can learn you are an urban planner and real estate developer, and actually come from a real estate family, which I'm interested to learn a little about. You're known for developing communities that are affordable and environmentally responsible. Excited to talk about that. You're a scholar and author of The Well Tempered City: What Modern Science, Ancient Civilizations, and Human Behavior Teach Us About the Future of Urban Life, which I have read and learned tons from. You're working on a new book that we'll be discussing. With your wife Deanna, you've helped to found the Garrison Institute, whose byline is Timeless Wisdom, Timely Action. You are an advisor to the government of Bhutan, and in your younger days, you founded a record label, Gramavision Records, for jazz and new music recordings. And so that's what Wikipedia has to say about you. Please introduce yourself as a human being and how you came to have such a comprehensive view of cities. Um, and in our conversations, you talked about an ontological stack. If you'd like to frame it in terms of an ontological stack, you are welcome to do so. But please introduce yourself.
Well, thank you, David. And it's a pleasure to be on this podcast, and it's a pleasure to get to know you, and particularly to get to know you in person. I read your work before I got to know you, and so I knew I've been a long admirer, and that's an honor to be
Thank you.
here. The uh, as you mentioned, my father was a real estate developer. I was born into a family of my father and his brothers and his father and uncle um, built middle income apartment buildings in New York City. And as I was growing up, I would visit these projects with him, and I loved the process of building. I loved the smell of the mud and the foundations and the concrete, and at a very early age began working in summers and uh, in construction. But at the same time, I grew up in the suburbs outside of New York City and had a very deep connection to nature and a strong sense of environmental pollution, and that nature was a threat and from human activity, and that was wrong. And at the same time, my mother was very involved in voting rights and civil rights. This is in the late 50s and early 60s and mid 60s. And all of these moved me deeply, and I wanted to figure out how could you put real estate development, environmental protection, and social justice together. And at the time, there was no model for that. And not only was there no model for that, but these things were thought in opposites. So the real estate developers thought of the environmentalists as the enemy. I mean, it was all. Um, so I began this search to find, and then I had my own spiritual development too, which was really trying to understand the nature of the universe and how it unfolded and our role in it.
What age were you
And
here?
this
I'm trying to
magnet.
remind you as a young man.
So I'm moving to like my teenage. So these feelings of connection for nature and social justice were quite young, like 6, 7, 8, 9. But as in my teens, then I really the spiritual unfoldings also began, and I was trying to figure out how to put this all together. And I had the good fortune to go to Yale University, where I studied, um, anthropology and sociology and psychology and philosophy, many things to try
Okay.
and figure out this integrative path. And as I came towards the end, I began to see that city planning and community development could actually be a framework to hold these questions. By the way, also by that time, I really began um, to sense evolutionary theory as a very important part of human development and social cultural
I
development,
was going to ask you
and a
about
framework
that.
that
So
we.
it's appearing at the very beginning. G. Evelyn Hutchinson was at Yale. He was a grand old man of ecology. I don't. Maybe he wasn't there by your day, but maybe his ghost was. I don't know. But so did you get a little bit of evolution at Yale?
I did actually. Somebody who I was working doing some independent study with said, "We're going to take you to G. Evelyn Hutchinson," and I went into his office, and um, he listened to me kind of lay out. I was trying to create this theory. By the way, the things I was trying to do the science had not yet. So the science of complex adaptive systems, which was actually what I needed to be able to understand what I wanted to understand, I had an intuitive sense for, but there was cybernetics, there was Norbert Wiener stuff, but it hadn't really emerged. And there was all this stuff about freedom and necessity, but that was too crude for me. So anyway, I came to G. Evelyn Hutchinson. I explained to him what I was thinking of, and he said, "You're on to something. Keep going." And
These words of
and
encouragement, E.O. Wilson, who was my mentor, um,
yeah,
was that way with people. He'd give these words of encouragement, and young people would just remember that their whole lives, as you have with G. Evelyn Hutchinson. So affirmative, basically, and such encouragement to keep going.
but what's interesting, where I failed was here's this amazing person who I've been introduced to, and I should have followed up with him because what I didn't know, what I learned later. So just I'm going to jump ahead. So for um, my wife and I had a very complicated honeymoon, but part of it is we trekked over the Himalayas and into Ladakh, and had I first went to the Himalayas in the 70s and had a long connection not only with Buddhism and Himalayan Buddhism, but the mountains and the culture and the indigenous culture before Westernization really took place. So what I didn't know was that G. Evelyn Hutchinson's great work was he went to Ladakh in the 30s and encountered Buddhism in its really pre-Western encountered state and did his earliest important ecological work there, looking at trophic levels in the
I
lakes.
didn't know that.
And yeah, and so there was so much more I could have learned from him and talked to him about that I never even got to until, learned about after it was too late. So
Okay, so then, catch us up to the present here now, and we'll work towards basically your current activities and some of your current projects, how you actually manifest all of this in an urban development project. But
got it.
don't accelerate. Please continue with your story. We don't have to hurry.
So I'm going to jump, and I'm going to go a little bit to the ontological stack. So there are two of them. So the first one is something called the three horizon theory, and the three horizon theory was invented by a guy at McKinsey who left McKinsey, and I can't remember his name. Should, but anyway, is that there are three ways of thinking about the the paradigms that we're in. So the first one is Horizon One. That's the world that we are currently operating in. And what I think is pretty well acknowledged by your listeners and in the much of the world that I'm part of is that the current system has passed its expiration date. The outcome of the current social political system, economic system, is that we are seeing increased income inequality. We're seeing increased uh, well, there's been racial separation for quite some time, but we're not doing a great job at healing it. We're creating climate change, biodiversity loss. There's a bunch of systemic negatives that are um, basically I'd call them negative social outcomes that are increasing, and that's we're going to call that Horizon One. Horizon Three is so how would we design a system that solve these issues? How would we design a system that had positive environmental outcomes, positive pro-social outcomes instead of anti-social outcomes, etc.? And we don't even have to totally imagine it from scratch because there have been many indigenous and previous cultures and some cultures even today that have done a pretty good job at mediating these things. They've not done a job of mediating it with 10 billion people or 8, 9, 10 billion people, but they have a lot of keys for us and how to think and how to behave. So let's say we can really construct a model for what that is, and that's Horizon 3. And the work of the Garrison Institute in many ways is take the wisdom of the world's contemplative traditions where you see the roots of all these solutions and then apply those issues to civil society and environment. Horizon 2 is the transition zone between 1 and 3. Now the problem is, or the fact is, that you can never imagine Horizon 2 from Horizon 1. You're too bound into the ontological stack of Horizon 1. You have to get yourself into the Horizon stack, the imaginative stack, the ontological stack of Horizon 3, and then step back to 2 to find the transition. Okay, so my work sits in two realms. One is what I call Horizon 1 Plus, which is how do we make this world as better, relieve suffering, improve our behaviors today, because there's a lot of work to be done here and now, and it's going to take a long time to change the system. And then the other work is in Horizon 3, which is to imagine what's the world that we really, the pro-social world that we, pro-environmental, pro-life world that we want to create, and begin to try and plant the seeds for that.
Yeah, if I could interject, then I think that just to translate that into my vocabulary, that cultural evolution is taking place all around us, whether we want it to or not. Currently, it's leading to problems, not solutions. So it has to become more conscious, more mindful. And there's your Horizon 3. Unless we know what we're aiming for, we'll never reach it. And then, of course, we have to evolve there. So there's your transitioning from the present to the future. And there needs to be a path to do it. For me, this maps onto the Four Noble Truths. Um, Life is full of suffering. Why? Because of cravings and greed and basically components of the system operating across purposes with each other. There is a path to end suffering. And what is that path? And here we go. First of all, it might be the path of Buddhism, but there might also be a scientific path as well, which we could travel both together. So that would be my way of expressing what you have also expressed.
And by the way, the work of the Garrison Institute is deeply grounded in um, in contemplative practice, but also in
Yeah.
science. And science, in a way, and its methodologies are a contemplative practice of
Oh,
its own.
we're so much on a
And
parallel track. I've been um, what I find is when I'm kind of hanging out in the spiritual part of this, there is this great appreciation of how systemic and interconnected everything is. But it's still the individual is still the point person, especially in Western um, Buddhism. And, the individual is being reached and then is appreciating how interconnected it is. But if it's that interconnected, then you can't proceed without science, just an intuitive feeling for interconnected. No way, no how. And so system science and evolutionary science become a spiritual practice. That's a required spiritual practice. So anyhow, we're going to have too much of a love fest here if we don't. I struggle to
so,
find something to disagree about so far.
and what's interesting is it's not just the biological evolutionary sciences, but it's also even the physical sciences. And when I was young, there was this divide between the physical and the biological. But quantum mechanics tells us that there's this great indeterminacy that points actually don't exist. That they are sum of probabilistics and relationships, and in a way that's what evolutionary systems are too. Um, so if we can, and that is actually the Horizon 3, which from the ontological point of view, it requires us to dissolve ourselves. And in fact, dissolve the point, be a wave. Think dissolve, and it's not even a wave. It's when I want to give myself a code word for it, I say don't think like a tree, think like a forest.
That's uh, that's there's so much to say there. We could spend the whole time on this plane, Jonathan. But do you know what I want to do next? I want to get real concrete and have you describe some of your development projects to see how this actually lands in the real world.
Got it. All right. So we're back to Horizon 1. So I need to give another framing. So there's amazing work that's done by a scientist named Raj Chetty, has created something called Opportunity Insights, and he has looked at intergenerational opportunity in the United States, and somehow he got tapped into the tax returns of every anonymized, but the specific returns of every person in America, and here's what he mapped. He looked at the income of the bottom quartile of people um, who were born in 1940, who came of age in 1966, and he looked at the income of their parents. 1966 was the peak time for opportunity in the United States. So if you were born in the bottom quartile with very few racial differences, if you came of age, you were 26 in 1966, there was a 90% chance you were earning more than your low-income parents. And the reason I say beyond race, because you were most likely born in a sharecropper family in the South, and you were working a union job in the North in 1966. So um, there was certainly enormous racial disparities, but you were doing better than your parents. If you were born in 1990 and turned 26 in 2016, and you're in a bottom quartile family, you were earning less than your low-income parents, and that has gotten even worse. He just published a new paper, so what's even more interesting is that this is entirely geographically located. So if you look at all the counties in the United States, and or zip codes actually, what you see is, I'll give you an example. If you live in the Upper East Side of New York City, you will have a statistical average life of living to 82. And if you move 20 blocks north to East Harlem, you have a statistical life of 69. And so there's literally a 13-year age difference by your physical
I
age.
know that
It has
there's
to
similar
do,
work in Chicago that shows the same thing, even more so, I think, in
right,
Chicago.
right. So Chetty has mapped this literally for every zip code in America. And so you can look at the health, you can look at income. At any rate, his main focus is opportunity. And what we see is that opportunity is incredibly geographically determined. And that has to do because geography relates to your school district, it relates to crime, it relates to many pollution, many factors. Okay, so since I'm a real estate developer, if opportunity is place-based, is location-based, then we ask the question, or I ask the question, can we actually create communities for lower income families? So my work is building affordable low income housing, mixed income housing. Can we create communities that transform the opportunity outcome of the neighborhood that they're in and raise it so that the children who grow up in our communities could perform like they lived in the Lower East Side, Upper East Side instead of East Harlem? And by the way, we do two things. We develop new affordable housing and mixed income housing, and we also buy existing properties, the big concrete buildings and brick buildings and low-rise sprawl that was built in the 70s and 80s and some of the 90s, and we transform this. We make all of our projects super green. We use healthy materials. We lower water and energy use. We lower their climate end use, and we bring social health and education programs to our residents. So now a project to make this
Yeah.
real. We recently finished a project with two partners, another developer called L&M and a community group called Akasha Network in East Harlem. It was a full city block. We built 700 units of passive house building. Passive house is a very green system that came from Germany, super insulated. So the walls are like 6 inches thick. The windows are triple glazed. This building uses a third of the energy of a normal apartment building built before 2003 in New York City, and half the energy of the normal, better energy efficient buildings in New York. It takes in air from the outside, purifies it, continually circulates through the apartments, so people are breathing very clean, fresh air, because there's toxicity in air is actually one of the things that stunts intellectual development, causes health issues, etc. It has an extraordinary charter school on site that serves both the community and the neighborhood residents. Harlem Children's Zone, that amongst things comes with a program where when a kid enters as 4 years old, they're given a $10,000 or $15,000 savings account that
Accumulates.
is then invested so that when they graduate, they have $100,000 or $150,000. We have a partnership with Union Settlement House, which brings social health and education programs, senior lunches, English as second language, job training, youth development, all kinds of programs to the project. The project, so super green, super connected to the, and all these things serve the community and the neighborhood. We have 4 community gardens creating healthy food. We, through this block, we found the map that showed there was an old Lenape Indian trail, and we have kept that as a pathway through the block, and we have filled it with, first of all, amazing community art that tells the history of the site going back to the Lenape and all the different cultures that have come through. We have community gardens, senior gardens, an amphitheater, children's play area, a contemplative spot that actually is a map of the stars above on the ground below. Um, and the whole project is designed in Fibonacci proportions. Fibonacci is the golden mean proportions. And by the way, when we presented it to the community, they said, well, you know, Fibonacci, where'd that come from? You know, Pythagoras, you know, like, that's Greek to me.
Oh,
You know, like, we're like, you know, we're Puerto Rican, and, you know, what does that mean to us? So our architect, who is the architecture firm called Handel, and there's a guy there who is just brilliant in new music. So he said, okay, so in East Harlem, the music is salsa. And salsa is based on a clave beat. So the way the clave goes is it's a 2-3 or 3-2. So 2-3 is da 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 1-2 1-2-3 1-2 1-2-3. Or it could go 1-2-3 1-2 1-2-3 1-2 1-2-3 1-2. Tito Puente, who was the great musical star of East Harlem, for his dances, when he do dance concerts, he invented something called the East Harlem Flip, where he confuse the dancers and go 1-2-3 1-2 1-2-3 1-2 1-2-3 1-2 1-2-3 dun dun 3-2 1-2, you know, 1-2-3 1-2 1-2-3 1-2. So this guy at Handel took our Fibonacci patterns going this way, and he put the 3-2 3-2 3-2 2-3 going that way and wove them together. And the community said, "You heard
oh
us."
man, that's
Anyway,
uh,
so
that's incredible.
okay, so this is a First Horizon project. And the reason why, so it's a,
I'd
by the
call it
way,
a third
we
horizon. I
have
think
an,
that's directly to the third.
no,
All
no, no,
right,
no,
keep
no,
going.
I'll explain why. So we have an income mix, by the way, that goes from formerly homeless to middle income. So people are literally earning nothing to people earning $110,000 a year. Um, one of the things I'm really proud of, we have another program that funds social services for the formerly homeless. We had 36 people formerly homeless move in last year. One passed away, and 35 of the original families are still there, meaning this actually did provide housing stability for them. Okay, so why is this Horizon 3, Horizon 1 and not Horizon 3? So first of all, the building is built out of concrete and steel and brick and glass and aluminum and copper and all these things that we harvest from the earth in non-sustainable ways. A real Horizon 3, we have to do something I call building biologically, where we're truly using regenerative resources such as mass timber, where we're taking wheat or rice chaff and compressing it to make insulation instead of minerals. It would be truly an ecologically regenerative building. This building uses more energy. It has solar, but it uses 20 times more electricity than it, 25 times more electricity than it generates. We buy renewable energy, but a Horizon 3 building is more likely to, will have a higher ratio of the energy that it generates to the energy that it consumes. And interestingly, our residents, so when our residents move in, they are protected, they're safer, they're healthier. The apartments are beautiful, they're clean, they're healthy, but they're still living in the contemporary Western system, which has not done well for them. I was, we were doing a social, just before this call, a social impact review in my company, and we're guesstimating, but we think that 10% of our residents, not in this building, but across our whole system, are illiterate. That they, you know, so we give our residents free digital access, but it's meaningless to somebody who's illiterate, frankly. I mean, they use it a little, they can YouTube, there's stuff they can do, but it's not meaningful the way it is
Well,
for
then
us.
I want to ask, go ahead, finish up, and then I want to.
Well, just to say, so I think it's essential that we do with these things that I call these horizon plus, horizon one plus things. They reduce energy use, they don't eliminate it. They reduce environmental impact, they don't eliminate it. They reduce poverty and the suffering of poverty, they don't eliminate it. And a true horizon three to me literally has to create different outcomes.
Okay, so I mean, it's amazing as it is, and you're saying it could be even more so. But two things. One is you've said that you actually do a good job assessing this. You get good scientific assessment partners, and then I want to know about how cost effective it is. And I'm guessing what you'll say, because I know from other studies that these things, whatever they cost, the indirect savings, so like the cost benefit ratios when you consider all the social services that don't take place, it's like 20 to 1 or 100 to 1 sometimes. So I think holistically, I know it's going to be very cost effective, but in a more narrow sense, how do you actually get funding for this? It must be much more expensive than putting up a standard uh, development, what other people do. So speak to me about those two things.
So, first of all, what's interesting about affordable housing is that it's a subsidized world because the rents are so cheap that there's no way that the rents can pay for a new building. So the question really is, so in a way, it doesn't pay for itself, but we have to compete in. So we have to compete for funding, and the funding is very complex. It comes from all kinds of sources, and I'm not going to use this time to go through that, but just to know that it's a lot of sources. There's not one easy way to fund affordable housing. And the sources come from the federal government, state, and city. They come through the city. And the city has 20 times more affordable housing projects that people want to get built in an enormous need than they have the money to build. So, in part, we're competing for the money. Now, on one hand, if you're running a city and you have limited funds, you want to build the most affordable housing per unit you can. So therefore, you're trying to build the cheapest per unit that you can. So what I've described is not the cheapest per unit. So we have to make the case that it's worth the city, the public realm paying more for something that's exceptional, at least to study it. So typically our projects, so this is another interesting thing. I don't want to be the guy who competes on the cheapest because that's not transforming the world. That's not, and and we can't be the most expensive because they're not going to fund us. They can't afford to fund us. So we have to figure out how to be the most cost effective and the most innovative at the same time. So in evolution, in part, like you're trying to attract resources. There's a competition part, but sometimes there's an attraction part that goes with this too. You see this a lot in behavior of birds and bees and all that stuff. So this kind of work is not only good for the world, it's the kind of project the public sector likes. They don't want everybody to do this because they can't afford it, but they're willing to pay a little more, a little more. So typically our projects may cost 5% more than the average
Only
affordable housing
5%?
project. But
Only
remember,
5%?
5%, yeah. By the way, if it was more than that, we wouldn't get funded.
Whoa. Uh,
So, so um, but okay, so the school is funded separately, and the Union Settlement Social Services was funded separately, and the Fibonacci doesn't cost anything. It's just about design and the design intent, and the super greenness is the part that costs about 5% more. Now, another interesting thing. So when you the if you redo, it's pretty easy, and we find this in both our new developments and when we buy existing buildings, to take any building that hasn't really been touched and reduce its energy costs by 20% and its water use by 25% just through LED lights and better insulation and caulking around windows and very practical, simple things. And those things have a fantastic payback. On the water side, and water is actually more expensive than utilities in many places, than electricity in many places. We we can get a 6 month or 1 year payback. We can invest $50,000 and save $100,000 in a year. So total makes economic sense. We can invest $500,000 in electricity and save $100,000 a year. That's a 5-year payback or a 20% return. So that works. That's Horizon 1. But if you want to make a building fossil fuel free, if you want to really get it off the current polluting system, it doesn't pay back. The costs are $100,000 a unit, and essentially there's no savings, except to the environment. Now,
Oh,
fortunately,
Jonathan,
under the
actually, let me just
Inflation
stop you
Reduction,
because when we factor in everyone's healthier and and better educated and so on, and so these huge ratios for the problems, basically the ounce of prevention, um, and uh, but the interesting thing about a city is that it actually is recouping those savings because um, at a smaller scale, the savings would go someplace else in the system. But the city is enough of a system itself that it actually will,
right,
in prison time and all of this stuff.
yep.
So and do you actually manage to make that case so that
So let me talk about how we do that. So first of all, we partner a lot with academic institutions. We currently have a big study that was funded by the JPB Foundation that brought in the Harvard School of Public Health looking at the environmental aspects of our buildings, Columbia Mailman School of Public Health looking at the social aspects, Dartmouth's Health Economics Group in the medical school looking at the health aspects, enterprise community partners looking at the public policy aspects, and a group called NeighborWorks, which has figured out how to best survey low-income populations. And that team we got funded, and is studying 10 of our projects that we do this work with and projects that haven't had this work done with them to compare to see if there's what the outcomes are.
is that in progress, or is
We
that
did
is that in
another
progress, or is there something can be read about that?
It's in progress. It's in progress. So we don't know the results yet. But we have another project. So we do this, we have all kinds of studies going on where we got a grant. Now we've had several years of grants to continue this, to bring telemedicine to low-income residents in a project in Newark. And the way it works is that we have trained residents to be resident health advisors. They go to the lobby of the building twice a week. They meet other residents. They weigh them. They take their blood pulse, blood oxygen level, and pulse oxygen level and blood pressure. That goes off through the internet to some system, analyzes it, comes back with recommendations on diet, exercise, healthy food, exercise, medicine, etc. That program has proven to reduce hospital emergency room admissions in half. Typical hospital emergency room, just to go into the hospital emergency room, literally, if you went in and there was a mistake and they processed you and you left, it cost between $6,000 and
What
$9,000.
between six?
Then then if they did an MRI and a CAT scan and gave you medicine and you had to see 3 doctors and stuff, the cost goes up even more. So the problem is that we as an affordable housing owner can't get savings that the hospital achieves, and the savings the hospital achieves is just less money they're spending. It's not like there's a check they're writing that they could write to us. So now let's talk about Horizon 3. So Horizon 1 is a system of systemic silos that we are still having to function in. We're trying to build the data and make the case for, now imagine a system where both your positive and negative externalities accrue to you. So if you were saving hospital emergency room admissions, you as a project, got a share of those savings. And imagine, by the way, not only it went to us as owners, but it went to the community health advisors, and maybe a little bit went to the residents, that there was systemic benefit, which is what you see in ecosystems. And imagine also if we were polluting or we were causing systemic harm, there was a systemic tax. And this is where I'm not an AI guy, but this is where with big data systems, we have the ability to discern a whole lot more about our positive and negative impacts, track them, and if we could assign value and accrue those back to a wide range of systems, the healthcare system, the housing system, the etc., you could begin to then give it credit and debits for its externalities, and maybe that should induce then the positive evolutionary social behavior that we want to achieve the
Yeah,
outcomes we
okay,
want.
great. So let me move our conversation along a bit and zoom out a bit to just urban planning writ large. And let me spend just a minute on some framing that I've done, including a whole series of conversations which made the following point. There's two things that don't work and only one thing that can work. One thing that doesn't work is laissez-faire, because it's just not the case that the pursuit of lower level interests just robustly benefits the common good. The other thing that doesn't work is centralized planning, because the world is too complex to be just planned by any group of experts. So what does work basically is a process of system level cultural evolution, which you more or less described, where you have to have the whole system in mind. And then in order to get to that goal, which you're calling the third horizon, you have to experiment. So that's a conscious process of cultural evolution in evolutionary terms with the welfare of the whole system in mind. System level adaptation requires system level selection. And so I think that, um, first of all, I want to see, what do you think of that framing? And I know because we've talked before that you're going to put in a little bit of a vote for centralized planning and use Singapore as an example. And I don't think that contradicts what I've been saying, but anyhow, I'm anticipating. Well, what do you think about this? First of all, laissez-faire, forget about it. Centralized planning, that was
Right.
Robert Moses. Um, um, or command and control in corporations. It's got to be a pragmatic, experimental, aka evolutionary process, and the welfare of the whole system has to be in front of you. That's your third horizon. You've got to have a systemic target of selection. So comment on that, and then bring in Singapore as you see fit.
Right. So Singapore is going to be the counterexample because number one, I totally agree with you. I'm a co-evolutionist with you, and um, the interesting thing. So absolutely, and you know what I described was a need for feedback
Yes.
systems. So for and you need. By the way, there's another thing you need. You need because we're humans. hmm, So I don't know if nature has an inherent morality or not. I think it's beyond morality, but it has something that guides it towards ever increasing systemic health and in this evolutionary process. Um, Janie Benris says it in life and exists to enhance the conditions for life. And you see in evolutionary systems, this can often, it goes up and down, but
I will just
enhance.
flag this. I beg to differ.
Sure.
I also beg to differ
Okay,
about
go for it.
physical systems, or we'll set that aside for the moment and continue. That's another
Okay.
conversation.
But anyway, in human systems, we need moral guidance. That the pure evolutionary process alone without moral guidance is insufficient. And we need, so you've written and spoken eloquently about Eleanor Ostrom and her rules of, and one of them, the punishment is within them, right? In effect, setting moral limits and setting guidance and creating the conditions of societal coherence to agreements is important. So you need, so just to put on the table that an evolutionary process needs structure, and with humans needs a deep, I think, moral
Yeah, and
center.
so
And
and so,
and what I
Jonathan, we
love
could
about
connect it back to nature by saying that the metaphor or the concept of society as an organism, which goes back to antiquity as a metaphor, now can be taken seriously. And if we actually use that metaphor, then we know how regulatory an organism is. I mean, my God, I mean, the anatomy, the physiology, all the regulatory circuit, all of those are correcting, which includes the kind of policing that that is necessary in a human system. So I think actually the concept of society as an organism, just there's huge I was going to say metaphorical transfer, but it's really not metaphorical because it really is the case that when a human group or a human society is very, very highly cooperative, then it is an organism because that's all organisms are units whose subunits are very highly cooperative. And not all natural systems are like that. There's my disagreement. So suffering exists in nature, and this anyhow. But there's another. We'll go there
Got
later.
it. Um, so I agree with you. And there was somewhere I was going to go with this. Okay, so if and you use the phrase pro-social, which reflects intentionality. So one of the interesting things about Buddhism is Buddhism, in effect, we have a mission or a pledge, which is to relieve the suffering of all sentient beings. And when I think all sentient beings, I think of the microbes in the soil, and I think of the
All of life.
mycelium, and I think of the bird. It's all of life. And so, if that becomes your moral center, then your system tends towards the better outcomes.
So Singapore seems
Okay.
to be top
So now
down,
let's, okay. So,
but probably isn't.
okay. So here's the thing. So let's go back to, and we've seen many pro-social systems evolve in history and in indigenous cultures. We've also seen many antisocial systems evolve. Um, we've seen slavery. Slavery was
Not
not a
just a Western thing.
Western European invention. Yeah, exactly. We've seen sacrifice, we've seen abuse, we've seen lots of, so, um, so without a moral, so naturally evolving systems can or cannot be better, and centralized planning systems can or cannot be better. Now, in Singapore, what's really interesting is so Singapore was an island that was, I think, an English territory. Anyway, it was part of Malaysia. Became free in the 60s or 70s, 60s, I think. But anyway, and and it was known for, and it was a mess. And Lee Kuan Yew, the guy who took over and was its first president, was really kind of a dictator. He, number one, completely eliminated corruption, which was widespread, and he said, "I'm going to hire the best people and pay them more, so they, but if they're corrupt, I'm going to kill them, essentially, or put them in jail." Um, but here's what they evolved. I'm going to give you, but they started with systemic system thinking. So I'm going to give you a couple examples. So starting a city state, starting from scratch, he invented a pension system. And the way the pension system works is that the employer and the employee contribute a great deal to the pension system. But that system also combined pension health system, so provides a very good public health at the same time. And it provides your housing. So he has a government, 80% of the housing in Singapore is built by the government sector. They're super advanced. They're continually trying to figure out what's the coolest and next great thing to build. They've actually come to New York and looked at some of my projects, and I've gone and looked at some of their projects. And but when you're a young worker and you're ready to get married, to start a family, you want a place to live, they basically sell you a unit in their public housing, and um, you're paying for it out of this 36% of something of your income that's going to this social welfare, that's this pension contribution that you're making. When you turn 65, the pension system buys the unit back from you. You get all the appreciation that's happened in the 40 years or whatever that you've owned it. They then lease it back to you, and all you do is pay operating expenses for the rest of your life. So all of a sudden, you're getting your retirement benefits, your Social Security, you have a very low cost of housing, but they get all the appreciation between that and when you die. And then they resell it at that higher appreciation. And somehow they figure this all out. So there's zero homelessness. Everybody's housed. Everybody's happy. And everybody retires with comfortable housing and a pension system that works. And it's, like they just apply this actuarial genius to designing a system that works. I'm going to give you another example. Singapore gets its water in a big pipe from Malaysia that comes across like a bridge. And they have a 100-year lease or 99-year lease on this water system. And they started in 66. So it's going to run out in 2065. Or those are more or less the right years. And 2065. So they said, we don't want to renew that lease. By the time that comes, we want to be water independent. So how are we going to do that? So one of the things they said is we need to create more natural places to create reservoirs and have the capture rainwater. So they looked at the whole island and they said, to do that, we could, one of the things that stops rainwater capture are roads. So what if we cluster mixed income, mixed use development by mass transit locations, subways and high capacity bus systems and all that, create walkable communities around it, connect it all well with this mass transit system, and start eliminating the roads between them, creating nature and parks and store water that way. This is an integrated solution that's like, the best of what we think urban planning is in terms of mixed use,
Yeah.
mixed green development, walkable communities. But it's serving this other purpose of water independence. And I'm not sure you would come with such solutions in a pure evolutionary system. There's something about the good top-down planning, which we see also in places like Finland, but don't see in many other places, that is creating these marvelous
Yeah.
integrations.
Yeah. So I think that what we can say is that in some ways it's easier to have systemic goals when you do have that degree of control. No doubt it remains experimental. Um, they just don't build it from scratch, know exactly what to do at first. That must be. I'd be very interested.
Oh, yeah, it's definitely
I'd be
evolutionary,
very
yes.
interested to know how consultative it is, whether they actually reach down to the lower level units, ultimately the individual citizen, and consult with them in any way in order to get that kind of bottom up feedback. Um, it would be very interesting to know that. And then there's the great question of how do we prevent it from going the way of authoritarianism and despotism when power is concentrated so often it just ends up the whole system gets turned to benefiting the elites. What prevents that from happening? Or maybe it has happened. So I don't know what.
Um, these are good questions. I don't know all the answers to them. I am actually going to be back in Singapore in a couple months, and I'll pursue this a little more. And one of the things is, so for example, somebody said to me, I mentioned Singapore, and they said, "Oh, Singapore, you know, it's illegal to import chewing gum." Because at some point somebody said, like, I don't like cleaning up the chewing gum from the sidewalks. The government said this. They said, we're going to ban chewing gum. And in the 70s, they banned long hair. If you were a hippie, you were not allowed in the country. And so, yes, there's authoritarianism. It is a democracy that is becoming more and more democratic. And it'll be interesting to see how it does. Now, in terms of lower level feedback, okay, so public housing has, to me, a problem. So if we look at indigenous systems, one of the beautiful things we see is that people live in intergenerational housing. And what that does is it means if they're grandparents, parents, and grandchildren and great grandchildren, and I've been in housing in Bhutan like that, then the grandparents are automatically taken care of. The grandchildren are automatically taken. You find that everybody's working, but a whole lot less harder. Everybody knows their role. Everybody's taking care of everybody. You don't need child care. You don't need elder care. And these are much healthier systems. And if we translate this to the United States, um, again, when I look at low income communities, if you have somebody working a full time minimum wage job, say a single parent, they may be earning $25,000 or $30,000 a year, which is impossible to live on in America. But if you take a grandparent and have them live with them, and that grandparent has Social Security, that could be $22,000 a year, all of a sudden it's a $50,000 a year income family. And if you had two grandparents, it's a $75,000 a year income family. And all of a sudden it's getting to middle class. Um, and all of a sudden there's childcare. By the way, interesting things happen. Not only is there childcare, which is great for the child and cultural transmission, but also means the mother could actually work some overtime and earn a little even more because the grandparents are there as babysitters. And there's one more thing, which is having the grandkids there, mean that the grandparents are online and like can use iPads and like fix stuff, like the grandkids can help them. So it's a fantastic thing. So our rigid systems in America make that impossible. It's just the way units get allocated and there's no multi-generator. We're just beginning to try and invent it. Okay, so Singapore, though, is completely experimenting with unit types. And they just came up with this unit type now that's like an American loft. Imagine that in public housing, where you can get at this open space and then you can build the walls that you want and like have more contained space and more bedrooms and then you can take them down and it's a flex unit that so I think they're
Okay, so
doing
I
it.
think that
Okay, John.
that's really amazing. So we could on all of these, Jonathan, we could spend our whole time. But I want to shift gears now to your scholarly side. Your book, um, The Well-Tempered City, reflects amazing scholarship all the way back to the origin of cities, and uh, uh, and I'm just fascinated to know how you do that basically with your with your busy day job and why it's important to you. So why is this panoramic um, overview of cities um, important to you? And maybe it's important to everyone. I mean, I actually I'm betting it is. But tell us why it is that you do have this scholarly side to you. And if you like, you could bring in your new book at this point. That might be a good a good thing to do. But anyhow, speak to me about why this breadth of scholarship is so important to you, and perhaps it should be for everyone.
Right. So I just want to note that you, as a social science scholar, then said, I want to figure out how cities work and I'm going to actually run real projects in cities and so it's a habit we share um, to try to apply these ideas. So um, once you see the world as a complex adaptive system that's co-evolving from all these social, psychological, ecological, energetic, metabolic influences, I, I want to understand them all, or at least understand people's points of view. You'll never understand them all, but people's points of view about them all. And so I love research. And remember, I said that, um, and research itself is a mindful practice.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, I love that.
and people have asked me, did you use a research assistant? No, because even when I was in college, even when I was in high school, I loved going to the library to look up one thing and then seeing the books that were adjacent and then just follow. Then you'd open it, you'd see a reference like it dedicated to some guy, and you go see who that was, and so I've always been trying to understand these threads. So I it's such an enriching experience for me, such an amazing learning journey for me to follow these threads. The discipline of where I need an editor is you can keep following them and they go too far. So the discipline is then to try and contain them and make coherence out of them. And that process is also really helpful. That's where you take ideas and when you find their coherence, you're taking them to the next level. You're integrating, you're finding the places where the differentiation becomes integrated. And anyway, I love doing that. And the book took decades, but was a great pleasure. And the book I'm writing now is on the idea of the commons and the common good. But essentially, it's if the old book was how do you design a great city? What's the well-tempered city? This is how do you design the social system that fits within a city. So it's and what's become clear to me is that the the elevator line of the answer is we have to stop focusing on individual outcomes and we have to focus on what are the best outcomes for the commons. We have to have an ethos or a moral system of the common good. We will never create the solutions to income inequality, biodiversity loss, climate change, racism, etc. From a self point of view, it has to be from a higher
Yeah,
selection level of
several
cognitive.
points about that. I think one of the things, uh, I mean, this is what follows from more formally from multi-level selection. As you know, I talk about multi-level selection as a perverse alchemist that turns gold into lead. And when you look at all our problems, they're typically cooperation and virtue at lower levels. So like cronyism and nepotism and nationalism and all these things are social units that are functioning quite well, thank you very much, just in opposition with um, other units. And the only solution to that is to declare I am first and foremost a human being and citizen of the world, of the whole earth. And then the lower level units don't go away. They exist. Our first horizon that deserve to exist. Even in a third horizon, they deserve to exist, especially the small groups and all in between, but always coordinated with the highest good um, in mind. That's the um, multi-level selection formulation. But as we become scholarly, this is something I've been thinking super hard about. Um, this just like takes us back to the early days of the Enlightenment and the whole concept of liberalism. And what I've been doing recently for my scholarly reading, is such things as the biography of John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham, and what way were they thinking? Utilitarianism, the whole roots of this in terms of both governance, what became economics, and so on. But at that time was philosophy, um, and for me, what's so clear to me reading this is just how the people back then, the issues were just the same. How do we reconcile individual interests and autonomy and so freedom and all of that with the common good? The questions remain the same. But they just did not have, no matter, it didn't matter how brilliant they were, they did not have the conceptual resources because they did not have complex systems science and they did not have Darwinian evolution. And without those two things, they just were, forgive me, flailing about. And so that means that what we have at our disposal today in terms of relatively mature bodies of knowledge about complex systems and evolution just puts us in a position to complete the Enlightenment project, connecting interests, basically, lower and higher level interest. We have conceptual resources that they did not. And so it seems, I like thinking of it that way. It seems grandiose, but to think of, we're in a position to, to, um, to succeed with the Enlightenment project, whereas our predecessors, no matter how brilliant, no matter how great, no matter how much we teach them in schools and so on, they just they didn't have the resources to work with.
So they didn't have the resources. But so it just happens that I've spent almost a year doing the exact same thing you did, deeply looking at the Enlightenment. And I actually start at 1066 with the Norman invasion of England, and I go from 1066 through the Industrial Revolution and kind of look at European exceptionalism and the colonization and the Enlightenment and all that stuff. And um, yes, they lacked the science, but they also lacked the moral system. They were growing a moral system of individuality. There were people who were thinking about the collective, who were not empowered. I don't know if you came across Win Stanley and the Diggers, or anyway, there were a lot of different, and Blake writing about dark satanic mills, and not everybody was on the same path, um, but it was a great program of self-aggrandizement, of national aggrandizement, of moving. There was a rebellion against the oppressiveness of the church that manifests itself not in the collective in general, but in the individual. And so that's the ontological underpinning that And then they use things like Newtonian thinking and the formation of the corporation, etc., and industrialization and breaking multiple, complex processes down to single pieces, repeatable pieces, and all that stuff. Um, but it was all focused on the enhancement of the individual, which ultimately is a worldview that was a destructive one. And you could have, I think, gone through that same progress with a different worldview. And but the bottom line is we now have that
Well, another
chance.
thing we can say, given that we're such a cooperative species and that uh, in- intense cooperation within groups is in some sense instinctive to us, then you could say that the psychological state of being part of something larger than yourself is very natural. And in that state, it's what we associate with religion and spirituality. Basically, you do have a higher good. You do regard it as more important than you. You want to serve it. It gives you joy to do so. You use words like sacred and worship and things like that. And then, of course, there's great punishment if you stray. And so the what you might call the religion spiritual uh, frame of mind, which does acknowledge um, that there is something larger than the individual, is uh, very natural. It just doesn't all boil down to self-interest. So I think this is where I think to integrate that state of mind, which does not have to be religious, certainly does not have to invoke supernatural agency. There can be secular versions of this, and there are. I mean, environmentalism is one in which you have a sense of sacredness about Gaia and so on and so forth. Certain aspects of religion are not required. In any case, these are all some of the things that I think make it so intellectually pleasing to be doing this at the same time that we're doing good um, practical work. Let me have you reflect upon that, and then I'll bring our session to one final chapter.
So I actually want to turn it back to you and ask. So I agree with you conceptually. So now, where are you seeing it manifested? This idea that of higher level cooperation for the common good.
Um, if I understand you correctly, I see it manifested everywhere. I mean, in many places, so everywhere, at middle level scales, at meso scales. And I think that um, there's just positive examples wherever we look of groups and groups of groups and so on that actually do function well as cooperative units. They are adaptable. How they came by it is in 1,000 different ways. It's like convergent cultural evolution. And it's just wonderful that we have so many positive examples um, to learn from, but they need to be gathered up conceptually, which I think is one of the main um, uh, services of a formal evolutionary perspective, is that we can see these common denominators. There's many of them in your book. So now maybe I'm not answering your question, however.
So one came to mind to me while I asked the question to you. It's limited, but it's pretty good. It's called the
Oh
Mondragon
yes,
Co-ops. So, so in something like 1956, a priest gets sent to a very poor area of Spain, and to be the local parish priest, and he's a socialist, and he observes that I think there were six guys who were running little car repair businesses out of their garages or their backyards or whatever. And he says, "Why don't you guys get together, share your tools together, form a co-op, and like be a real garage?" And they did, and it actually worked. And to make a long story short, he kept organizing more and more co-ops. And today, in this region, this county called Mondragon in Spain, um, there are 100. There this whole co-op network has an annual turnover of $17 billion. There's something like 70,000 people who are employed. Um, they have a Mondragon University, a Mondragon hospital, a Mondragon. They've
yep,
co-opted everything. And what was interesting is that um, And they're no longer, there are now middle class communities instead of a poor community, and that when COVID came, about 10% of the businesses either had to shut down or shrink, and every single person was absorbed by another one of the co-ops, that the whole system self-sustained. Now, what's interesting is this co-op is all about worker empowerment and collective ownership, and they don't they are way behind the curve on environment, and they kind of view environmental regulation as a negative, and a bunch of other things. So they're a model. So to me, they're a great model of a wonderful idea of the common good growing and being beautifully articulated, but them having a boundary and a
Yep.
limit to it. So we have to so we have to figure out how we
Yep,
expand that
totally.
boundary.
If we're trading examples, I'll give one of my favorite ones.
Yeah.
And I have a whole podcast and other podcasts on this that we'll reference. It's a manufacturing firm in the Midwest called Berry Miller. It makes stuff. But the CEO, Bob Chapman, is really just a really good Christian and truly implements Christian values and genuinely cares. I mean, really, for his people. And so that's a great story on its own. But what's really great is that they have acquired, but they don't use that word, they use the word adopt, over 140 other companies and accomplish the same transformation. And so, in my terms, this is a replicated experiment in prosocial cultural evolution, replicated 140 times. Now, it's well known in the business world. There's a book on it, Everybody Matters, with Bob Chapman and Raj Sisodia. So you might say it's well known, but not outside its borders. It's not known as much as it should be. Because what this is telling us, and we could pile on so many other examples, we know it works. And one reason why it's hiding in plain sight is because of competing narratives. And something we haven't said here is about how much of what we see in the world is basically how we perceive it on the inside. So there's this whole inner-outer um, conversation, basically, which we could schedule a second podcast, but um, that's important. The way I want to finish up, although first of all, have you respond to that, then our final segment. So, but anything you'd like to say?
Go to the final segment because I suspect your final question is going to be the
Yeah, it
integrated
is.
answer.
It's just like, it's just and you've already kind of introduced it with your concept of the third horizon. What would, what could things look like in 10 years? That's my final uh, question. What could things look like? How close might we get to the third horizon in 10 years? Is that possible?
So first of all, we you know we won't get there everywhere because there's a big Earth and there's 10 billion people at that point, and a lot of systems to be evolved, and it's unlikely that China or Russia are going to make the evolutionary changes that that Bhutan may make, for example. But what I would hope is that, and I like your example of mid-level. You're calling mid-level because small is important, but is not impactful. We need to show that small can scale to mid. But my hope is that we'll have mid-level cities, mid-level companies, mid-level states, mid-level nations. By the way, we're already seeing this in something called the Wellbeing Economy Alliance of 6 nations: Scotland, Wales, Iceland, Finland, New Zealand, and Canada, who are all working on shifting their economy to be focused on well-being. So at that mid-level, in 10 years, we could make enormous steps towards pro-sociality, pro-ecology, and towards these integrative systems where the feedback is positively reinforcing for the right outcomes. And we have the data systems to reinforce that, and we have the moral center to guide that, and and that those would be known, so that people could point and say, yeah, there's a better way. That'd be pretty good.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, again, I have little to add to that. I guess the only thing I'd add to it is that uh, to emphasize its plausibility, this is something that actually can happen. Why is that? I think in part because it returns us to this idea of, as Einstein put it, the theory decides what can be observed. And I think that the more people just encounter these ideas, which are so new, especially on the evolutionary side, that they have not been encountered by the vast majority of people that need to know about it, who are open-minded and brilliant and well-read and so on. It's just they have not yet encountered it. And when they do, then it reorients common sense. And so that's something that can take place very fast, especially in the internet age. These ideas can spread. And that's what, of course, our efforts, and especially on my side, the New Paradigm Coalition is all about. Just spreading these ideas, making them contagious. And um, Bob Chapman actually has a framework. What did he say? He's basically that, cooperation can spread faster than COVID. Uh, when you look at how fast does a virus spread, that's fast. Well, ideas can spread that fast. Ideas can spread that fast. And so positive evolution can be as rapid as any other kind of evolution. We know we have, like, Facebook is like 18 years old and all of that. These things burst upon us and often take us where we don't want to go. But with a little more mindfulness, good things can spread that fast. And so 10 years turns out to be a long time against that metric. So that is good things are possible in 10 years uh, if we know if we go about it in the right way and if we think about it in the right way. That gives me a lot of hope, and I think that, of course, you're obviously a very hopeful person, um, without being uh, misled about the problems in front of us, the poly crisis um, in front of us. So in any case, would you like the final word?
I think I endorse what you said. I think the final word is thank you for this wonderful
Okay,
conversation.
well, all good. Thank you so much.